Chapter 401, The Price. Chris POV. Location, Fort South. My body was an absolute wreck, and the brief respite from the 2 levels I just gained didn't last long. The essence coursing through me did more psychologically than physically to repair my condition. I had just enough spirit left to use it as a crutch to limp back toward Vanessa's fort whatever. Rachel had relayed the names of all of them, but I hadn't kept track. There were way too many for that. For one of the first times, it wasn't wounds that were stopping me. It was pure exhaustion. Sure, there were a few places that were sore or cut up a bit, but nothing life-threatening. The stab wound from Tasunka was still a constant aggravation, but it had clotted with the help of frozen patchwork. It was the run that did it. Glacial March had drained more and more from me the faster I got. The skill worked wonders to reach the speeds it had over such a large distance, but it had taken a commensurate cost to do so. The stamina drain from running for nearly a week straight was substantial. The brief rests were barely enough to keep up. My mana wasn't doing so hot either. Freezing the lake, even for as small an area as I did, still drained me over the long distance. An entire day was spent just running over the water. Then I'd thrown around skills aplenty that drained me further. After already coming from a battle where I hadn't recovered to full, my spirit was even worse off, only behind stamina in how low I'd forced it. The amount I was using to remain upright would leave me bottomed out by the time I arrived at the fort's gates. My head pounded both from mana deprivation and law overuse. Using my ice law to enhance myself had taken its toll. I'd briefly used my wind law to increase my speed, but the strain was too much to make it feasible for long. The concepts I'd used to forge my wind law didn't lend themselves to speed easily, or at all, really. Thinking on it, Tasunka had a concept in his that was speed-related, but the battle hadn't gone on long enough for me to ferret it out. The slicing concept I'd felt intimately, but whatever else he'd used would remain a mystery. Maybe I'd used that for my own? I didn't know yet. The only thing I could still wield if it came to a fight was my bloodline. The run was far too long to call on it for the entire journey, and I'd only started to burn it once I got close. The fight had only taken minutes, which left a lot in the tank in case I needed it. I dearly hoped I didn't. Felt like my arms would fall off if I had to swing my hammer again. The distance between the fort and the camp, which I had previously covered in seconds, took minutes this time around. The entire time, people atop the walls pointed and stared. A few raised bows, but were quickly admonished by someone I couldn't see. Most were just scared stiff. When I was within earshot without yelling, a male voice called down. An undertone of fear was hidden well, but I'd heard it in people before after battles. Christopher Zelensky, I presume? That's me. I huffed. I didn't have the energy for much else than that. Open the gate, the same voice ordered. I was thankful the back and forth ended there. I needed some reprieve and a good night's rest before going on to the next spot. I hoped there were decent beds in this place. As the gates opened outward, an interesting choice, I saw a plethora of people standing inside, staring. I didn't have to use aura detection to know they were fearful. It was written clearly enough on their faces. A man in light, leather armor, wielding a staff, greeted me with a poorly armored woman by his side. The armor itself wasn't poor, at least it hadn't started out that way, but it was definitely poor now that it was falling apart. It had done its job, though, and the woman was still standing, even if the armor would fall off soon. My name's Zach, and this is Jillian. We're in charge of Fort South. He introduced himself and the woman next to him. I nodded as politely as I could. Howdy. Forgive me for being terse, but a nice cold bed is calling my name right about now. Sure, he said a bit too quickly. I'll show you to a room you can use. Isn't it a nice warm bed? Someone mumbled, but I ignored it. I then followed after him as he led me deeper into the fort. It wasn't that large, objectively speaking, for strong walls encompassed a large, rectangular 3-story building, and that was about it. It was all constructed of strong stone, and I could tell high-level masons and engineers had gone at it with their best. I'd seen similar work from Phillips guys. The fact that it only had divots and craters and not in complete ruins was a telltale sign of that much, at least. Any less, and the attacks would have overwhelmed the structure. Here you are. Zack opened the door to a very Spartan room with not much furnishings besides a night table, and blessedly, a wide and comfortable-looking bed. Thank you, I said gruffly. And now if you don't mind, I'll be taking a nap. I dropped my hammer beside the door and began unsticking my armor from my skin. The outer layer of ice from glacial plate had already been shed. Now I needed to get out of the bloody and broken metal. The only good thing was that the sweat was minimal. My body was strange with the changes I'd undergone, and sweating less was just one of the few things I'd grown used to. Turned out, if your body was already running cold, it defeated the purpose of cooling off through sweating. And if I did start exerting myself that much to where I needed to, my mana did more than expelling a little water ever could. My side wound reopened, and I grunted through the pain. Tasunka had done worse than I thought he would. The power he could dish out while mounted was impressive. I hadn't taken a wound like it in a long time, and he did it through my armor, glacial plate, and Jotun's resistance. It made me wonder what grade class the man had. Fortitude was my second highest stat, and it wasn't that far behind strength. He was riding at me with the momentum of both him and a 1,000-pound beast. Zack cleared his throat from the hallway. If you need it, I can call a healer for you. His eyes were glued to the chunk missing from my side that was currently dripping blood on the floor. That's all right, I'll heal up fine. Sorry about the floor. I waved him off and channeled some mana through frozen patchwork. Again. Now that I wasn't violently moving about, the skill would work without issue. Cold meditation would speed up my healing, especially now during winter, but I just didn't have the energy. Sleep was calling me. I'd figure it out in the morning. This shows I need a better way to deal with it, though, I thought. I was so used to being around the Frostheim and having Ashley on hand to fix me up. I'll, see you in the morning then, he said, and hesitantly left. It wasn't that much longer until I was blissfully in dreamland. I woke up confused. I wasn't sure where I was, and nothing around me looked familiar. My hammer was by the door, and my armor was spread across the room without a care. My pack was missing, and, I was at one of Vanessa's forts. It took my groggy mind a moment to register everything that had happened. It was a lot to think about, and I chose not to for a few moments. The bed was comfortable, and I didn't feel like getting the day started just yet. I knew what it would hold, and it didn't fill me with joy. A few moments later, I caved and brought up the notifications I hadn't looked at. You have slain. I pushed those away quickly. I didn't want to see them, read them, or look at them all that much. It was proof I didn't need, and I would leave it at that. Congratulations. You have leveled up. Congratulations. You have leveled up. Those were better, but still left a touch of bitterness. It hadn't needed to come to this. It hadn't needed to. I pushed the negativity away. It had happened. It was going to happen again. And there was nothing I could do to change it. With those cheery thoughts to start the day, I got up and groaned. Not from pain, but from remembering that my pack, the pack that held all of my things like extra clothes and supplies, wasn't in the room. I'd buried it before everything happened, and now I needed to go get it. Exiting the room and venturing through the building was confusing, but I found the exit eventually. It wasn't all that big and wasn't built to be a maze. At first, it surprised me that not many people were up, but it made sense after some thought. They'd just gotten done fighting nearly constantly for over a week. Catching up on some sleep was more than understandable. Luckily, finding my pack wasn't all that hard, and I was back within the walls before half an hour was up. It was surprisingly easy to get the guards to open the gate for me. As I re-entered the building, I heard voices. Familiar voices, as one of them was Zack's. You should have seen it, he said quietly. A chunk was missing from his side. I could see his insides. A woman spoke next. One I didn't know, and her tone was confused and astounded. And he walked back like it was nothing? Why didn't he ask for a healer? No, you don't understand. Zack spoke again. The wound was old, like a few days old. It wasn't from the camp. You're saying he had it before coming all the way here? The woman asked. I had a feeling who the two speakers were, and I wasn't going to stand around eavesdropping on them. Good morning. I announced my presence before stepping into the common room. Only the two of them were in the room. Zach and Jillian, looking much better after some sleep and a shower. I hadn't had the second part yet, but I was getting there. Everyone else was still sleeping, most likely, or somewhere else. Lore, Zach stuttered, trying to find the right way to address me. Christopher's fine. I don't partake in any of this Lord nonsense, I said with what I hoped was a friendly smile. I wasn't entirely sure what my face looked like, nor was I 100% sure there was no blood on it, or dirt, or I'd leave it at that. Neither of them seemed comfortable with what to say next, so I tried to ease some tension. Do you have any water I can use? I asked, holding an empty canteen. I ran out. Yes, here. Without standing, Zach manipulated some water that streamed from a large barrel in a side room I couldn't see clearly and into my canteen without spilling a drop. The control was impressive. A water mage, I presume? I commented and thanked him with a slight nod. Yeah, it's why I'm here in the south. He answered almost on reflex. Can't have me up north with the fire flingers. It had surprised me that the area was lacking burn and scorch marks. It made sense to separate people into effective groups when you were splitting up already. I rummaged around and took a small pouch from my bag. The beans were bordering on stale, but they were better than nothing. Grinding them was easy with my strength, but I took out a handheld grinder anyway. It was more uniform than doing it myself. A cup was retrieved next, along with a French press. It all came together quickly from practice, but I was missing one thing. Do you mind heating this for me, please? I turned to Jillian for the first time. I had a way to do it without her help, but it was slow and annoying at times. Thankfully, it didn't come to that. She reached out and pressed a finger against the French press and channeled some mana. Fire mana, specifically, which got the water heated up nicely in a flash. She eyed the etchings and rune work on the device suspiciously. Alright, my way wasn't that slow and not as annoying as described, but it was a good way to break the ice, so to speak. And it worked. Is that coffee? She asked. Yes, it is, I said gladly and smiled, showing it off like it was a prized possession. Rachel got it for me from all the way down in the Golden Isles, or what used to be called Florida. You want some? I would love some, she said with longing in her eyes. Hold out a cup then. I'd made enough for 3, but Zach didn't comment. More for me. How come you're not up with the other fire flingers? I asked, using his slang term. Rachel would be pleased at the name. I came here specifically, she said, eyes shooting toward Zach briefly. Plus, I don't really fling it like the others do. I can swing my sword anywhere that's needed. I gathered what I'd first overlooked. Good for them. Why don't Dash? I started. How did Dash? Jillian began. We spoke at the same time, but I waved at her to go ahead. How did you do it? She said fervently. I mean, you're lower level than I am, yet you wiped them out like it was nothing. How? My smile dimmed, being reminded, but I gave her an honest enough answer. Level isn't everything. You should know that by now. I know that, but there were thousands of them. She went on. You went in and bam, it was over in seconds. It takes Dash. Zach put a hand on her shoulder to rein in her enthusiasm. Maybe we can wait on that, honey. What were you going to say? I gave him a thankful nod and sipped my coffee. Why don't you show me what you have in terms of maps for the area? I don't really know where I'm going, and I only got here because I was directed. Rachel's turn left. No, that's too far, go back right. 10 degrees right and over the spring. Had been fun exactly once. I didn't look forward to it happening again. I wasn't even sure how she was tracking me. Maps? Why? Zach grew confused. I thought you were sent to reinforce Fort South? I was, and I have. Now my aim is to do the same thing as yesterday as many times as I have to. I said somberly, not regretfully, but my voice was devoid of any eagerness or excitement. As I had felt when I woke up, I didn't look forward to what I had to do today. I had been called and I had answered. This was the price. Chapter 402. Then and now. Chris POV. The maps were given freely, and I had my next few targets. Based on how quickly I had dealt with the first, I imagined I could handle 2 or 3 a day if they were of the same difficulty. I doubted they would be, though. This one didn't seem to be made up of any heavy hitters or faction elites. Plus, Zuri was still out there, and I hadn't forgotten that there was still New Canada and Boston to consider. Still, as I set out from one fort to go smash down another, a memory of the tutorial resurfaced. Most of the time, such a thing would be shunted back into whatever black box it came out of. That time was better left locked up in a dark cave than reminisced about, but this memory wasn't painful or drenched in grief. It was one of the few. It reminded me that this wasn't the first time I'd run around to hotspots playing whack-a-mole before. The fallen pylons that had turned into pseudo-dungeons felt exactly the same as what I was doing now. Instead of going around killing wave beasts, though, it was camps of human attackers. An unhelpful distinction I tried not to think too hard about. The next fort that was under attack was a ways to the north. I had to pass by 2 other forts before I could reach it, but it didn't take all that long at a full sprint. They weren't that far apart in the grand scheme of things. A few hours to each one, so it took me around 6 hours to reach 3 forts away, and I arrived where I was needed. Rachel sent me a few messages through the stone asking what I was doing, but quieted down after I told her. She'd been there when I'd done this the first time and left me to my work. The Fort of Thorns, or Fort Thorns, I wasn't sure which and didn't clarify, was led by a mousy woman who'd seen better days. She wasn't exactly appreciative of my arrival, but after the deed was done, she thanked me wholeheartedly as I left. The reason my arrival upset her was clear once I walked back to the fort for a brief rest after the attackers had been dealt with. The fort was surrounded by plants, with thorned vines covering the walls like ivy on old houses. I assumed they'd once been alive and vibrant, but all I saw were shriveled and dead plants hanging on because they were frozen stiff rather than gripping in their own right. Tundra's descent had killed her plants. At first, I assumed I'd killed all of them, but I either overestimated myself or underestimated the fort leader. She had new vines sprouting from the ground, and others were revitalized in just moments. The amount of mana it took was a lot, but it got the job done, and it wasn't like she would be needing the mana in the near future. Congratulations. You have leveled up. After that, Wheat Fort was next. I didn't question the name. A warrior named Ian was in charge of this one and actually ran out of the fort to help me once he felt my arrival. It was entirely unnecessary and was actually quite harmful, but I didn't make him leave. The battle wasn't close enough that toning down my wider abilities, so I didn't hit him mattered in the long run. It just took a little longer. Congratulations. You have leveled up. With nearly 10 hours spent running around, and a few more fighting and resting, I called it a day there. I could have rushed off to the next one, but I was tired. Tired mentally and physically. The fights themselves weren't all that strenuous, but they had all added up. Mentally, there was only so much slaughter I could take in a day. Too much blood and too many faces ground away at my motivation to keep going. Part of me hoped that with the 3 forts I'd freed from attack, Zuri and her faction would reconsider things. It was a small and far-fetched hope, but it was there. Giving them a day to consider wasn't hard to do, either, so I spent the night in Wheat Fort before heading out again the next day. My armor was dented and scratched from the many battles, and a large piece on my side was still missing, but it was getting the job done. Putting it on was more difficult, but doable with a bit of care toward the dented and worn areas. My hammer was as pristine as the day I'd summoned it. Nothing had come close to damaging it yet, which was a good thing. I wasn't sure how long it would take me to recover from summoning it again. The morning after, I said my goodbyes to Ian and the fort and set out for the next one. I expected the day to go similarly to the last, but I was oh so wrong. My plans were derailed right from the start, and I didn't get more than a few miles away from Fort Wheat before I felt a beacon of power rushing toward me. The person's aura was blaring loudly and impossible to miss with aura detection. The man, as I saw when he got closer, was strong. Stronger than anyone from the Imperial faction I'd faced yet. Human? Level? I didn't get the exact level, but it felt similar enough to my own that I was confident it was above 120. I had to watch out for 2 D-rank skills, with one being handpicked. "Stop right there," he called loudly and boldly. Assurance dripped from his tone, which surprised me. I hadn't met anyone that was so sure while facing me. Not sure where this was going, I complied. I knew he was an Imperial, as that was obvious from the colors he was wearing. White mainly where Flamefalls mainly wore red. Also, the rest of his getup was impressive from what I could tell. His armor glittered in the morning sun, reflecting the rays nearly as well as the surrounding snow. It looked well made, and I could feel some enchantments in it from here. A sword was at his side, with a hand ready to draw it. My hammer had been in my hand the moment I'd felt his aura. It was surprising he'd left his weapon sheathed. A draw skill? Other than enchanted plate armor, he wore a thick fur cloak for warmth. I assumed there were layers underneath the armor for the same reason. His face was visible through a raised faceplate on his helm, along with a poorly grown beard. It looked closer to a few days of growth than a true beard. His pale skin was rosy red from the cold, and his mouth was tied up in a snarl. What was even more obvious was the clear animosity rolling off him in waves. He was an enemy, and he knew I wasn't on his side. From the anger in his aura, I assumed he knew who I was and what I'd been doing. Being told to stop wasn't the main reason for me doing so. Behind the animosity and anger in his unconcealed aura, there was something familiar to me, and I was curious if what I thought was true. Leadership was different to different people. It didn't always feel the same from person to person. The Admiral felt much different than Marcus and Vanessa. Noble titles were even harder to identify. I assumed this man had both. My guess was that he took a warrior baron-style class like I had been offered. I stopped because of curiosity. Identify yourself, the man yelled after we'd come to a stop a few 100 feet apart. Far, if not for stats. I'd reach him quickly if it came to it. Weight of the Arctic was empty since this was the first fight of the day, but I had enough without the boost. I turned my head. Odd to demand such when you have not done so yourself. He seemed affronted that I wasn't aware of who he was. I'm Anthony DeLuca, the Baron of Brooklyn, he said pompously. Well, it came off that way to me. I didn't go around calling myself the Viscount of Frostheim. I wasn't aware there was a Baron of Brooklyn. I thought aloud. And boy, was that the wrong thing to say. Admittedly, I wasn't well versed in the intricacies of the Imperial faction. I knew of Zuri, and that was about it. I also knew of the enormous population the faction had, but that was impossible to miss. Lower barons or notable people inside the faction were unknown to me, because I didn't much care. We were half a continent apart, and if Vanessa hadn't called on us, we'd never have come into conflict. You don't even know the faction you face yet, but into a conflict that's not yours. How stupid are you? He sneered. However curious or novel this may have turned out to be disappeared. I didn't take well to being insulted, especially to my face. Mind your tone, I said flatly. Insults will turn this conversation in a direction you won't care for. Is that a threat? His foot slid back, and his grip tightened. No, I said, doing nothing in response. It's a promise. It was tense for a few moments before he broke it. I'll say again, he said. Identify yourself. Christopher Zelensky, I said, but didn't see the point. It was obvious he'd sought me out, at least it appeared that way. Why else would he be directly on my path and set on intercepting me? You're the Lord of Frost that I've been hearing tall tales about lately? The demon in the snow. He actually laughed. Good. Saves me a trip from coming to find you. You've caused enough problems already, and cleaning up your mess is already too much of a hassle. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. He was either arrogant to the point of being stupid or just plain good old-fashioned stupid. Surrender now and you shall live. Don't, and well, you get it. He waved his offhand. Tyr's judgment was my response. The chain shackled the two of us together, and I launched forward as soon as the skill latched on. If he was offering battle, I would oblige him. He moved as soon as the ethereal chain manifested, and in one smooth motion, drew his sword and thrusted. The move was well practiced, and the skills involved created a powerful spear of force headed straight toward me. Too bad for him, it didn't do anything. I let it fracture glacial plate, which refroze seconds later. He swung again and flowed into a third strike by the time I was on him. A shattering hammer-powered blow struck and reverberated out. The Baron of Brooklyn died before getting off a fourth swing. Well, that was disappointing. I wanted to see what his class was like. You have slain in Mortal Kombat, human, level 135. Congratulations. You have leveled up. Was it his level that gave him confidence? Could he see mine and assumed he was stronger? I wasn't sure. What I was sure of, though, was that the amount of essence I got was less than I predicted. The rush after killing Tasunka was like a tsunami, but from him it was weak. It was still large, don't get me wrong, but not overwhelming like it had been the first time. Did he only have a rare class? Lower grade classes took less essence to level, which resulted in less to take when slain. It could also be that his profession was way behind. Like not even in D rank behind. He was a baron, though. Shouldn't he have been stronger? Thoughts that never crossed my mind were of how many levels I'd gained recently. With everything going on and running from fort to fort, I just didn't think of how many stat points I'd recently received. Just after my arrival here in New York, I'd gained 1,024 stats. 1,024. Strength, 3239-3,543, plus 304. Agility, 1548-1608, plus 60. Perception, 722-746, plus 24. Fortitude, 2748-3042, plus 294. Endurance, 1641-1791, plus 150. Vitality, 1125-1215, plus 90. Free points, 51-153, plus 102. If you included the gains from the reservation as well, that number climbed to 1,537. With a total stat count of 12,703 before all of the new levels, that was an increase of over 12%. 12%. It wasn't a new law or a rank in body refining, but it was still a large increase in power. One I still hadn't gotten used to, and hadn't come to terms with. My comparison was based on how strong I was then, not how strong I was now. Chapter 403 Six Barons. Vanessa POV. A small smile played at her lips for the first time in weeks. Somewhere in the back of her head, she knew that getting joy knowing people were dying was wrong, but she just couldn't help it. After watching her glorious red markers slowly get pushed back day after day, as their numbers were continuously, albeit slowly, cut down, she allowed herself a touch of joy. Joy at watching white marker after white marker disappear. Rapidly and in large swaths. Every hourly update saw more and more disappearing. If this goes on, I'll be able to take the field as the aggressor. That thought caused her smile to widen. She was sick of watching and waiting. Her fire demanded action to be stoked in battle, and being refused angered it. The dragon essence in her bloodline amplified that feeling, wanting to defend what was hers. Wrangling both her fire and remnant bloodline emotions was a struggle, but here she was, watching in her high tower while others fought. When she first imbibed the fire WRM bloodline, she feared she may have reached too far. Dragons were powerful, and even the lowest tier was pushing it back when she'd done so. Upgrading it to Fire Drake had pushed it a second time, but she'd needed the power. She wasn't sure of beating Zuri without it. The evolution had nearly caused her to lose control. Nearly. And nearly only mattered with hand grenades and horseshoes. Vanessa had seen what happened to people who weren't so lucky. Reaching too far and losing control left them irritable and erratic at best, and feral at worst. Most were in between at various ranges of animalistic behaviors depending on severity. The instincts of their bloodlines overpowered their will, driving them to behave and act as it demanded. She'd seen people hiss and growl, eat raw meat, and prune themselves like birds. Having the urge to protect what was hers, which she already felt without the bloodline, was tame in comparison. All of that was from her own bloodline, which was one of the strongest there was. Yet she couldn't help but wonder what kind of bloodline Christopher had. She still remembered when the deep, rich blue marker, the same shade as Rachel's, first appeared. It appeared on the eastern border of the map suddenly and rocketed across the distance. The speed involved was astounding. Every hour was another large jump west. Vanessa knew the strengths of the most notable people. She knew Zuri was like herself with high intelligence and wisdom, that the Admiral's highest stat wasn't strength like people assumed it was, but endurance. That Travis in Yellowstone had more mana than people thought. Which was why she knew agility wasn't one of Christopher's top stats. His top 3 stats were strength, fortitude, and endurance in that order. It was hard to estimate exacts, especially with a spirit anchor that amplified his endurance, but she was confident enough that agility wasn't among his top 3. It has to be a skill, she thought. There's no way he has such strength and toughness in addition to high agility. Even if he has a legendary class, as I assume, there are only so many stat points it gives. But what kind of skill allowed a speed increase like that? It took a few directions relayed through Rachel, but his arrival was swift, devastating, and brutal. Exactly like she had been told. Zach from Fort South reported that the entire contingent of Zuri's forces had been wiped out to the last man. That the encampment had been so thoroughly destroyed that it would be easier to raise it and rebuild than to fix it. Vanessa had already been happy with that alone. Then he woke up the next morning and did it again. Then a second time. Twice in one day. Twice. Vanessa watched as the markers vanished. At this rate, he's doing more to defend than I am. That made her angry. The building anger at being left to watch finally boiled over. She looked toward her staff and battle armor resting on a stand and picked them up. It was time to push the advantage and see how much she could burn. Zuri POV. Location, Empire City. You're saying Anthony is dead? She asked, even though the faction screen that was devoid of DeLuca's name was staring her in the face. She just couldn't believe it. When war had been pushed and lobbied for, she never thought it would come to this. She knew it was necessary, and there was nothing that could stop it, but it still hurt seeing the reports. She never wanted this. She hadn't even wanted to lead, but she knew who would if she hadn't stepped up. Gangs, warlords, and petty tyrants were aplenty in the big city, and if given the chance, those kinds of people were exactly who would take charge. They would have come back from the tutorial with a bit of power and take everything like it was their God-given right. They almost had, too. If Zuri hadn't been forced to push herself and experience what she had, that was exactly what would have happened. Thankfully, she'd had the power to stop it. She'd beaten them once, and continued to do so every day, but it was draining. They eroded her leadership at every turn, undermined her whenever possible, sowed dissent and rebellion with every breath. Nearly all her efforts were on supporting and unifying her faction. It was impossible to make everyone happy. There were far too many people for that, but she did her best. So when they called for war, she let them. The public support she would lose if she didn't would have been too much to bear. Food was scarce and expensive, dungeons were few, and raw materials were impossible to get hold of in great quantities. Food she could import at great cost, but she could do it. Crafting materials, not so much. Everyone had need of them, and no one was giving them up freely or in large volumes. More dungeons were out of her hands. The 3 they had were more than most cities, but it wasn't enough. Every beast worth the essence had been hunted long ago, and nothing in the surroundings was worth the effort to hunt. Her people were starving, without resources, and painfully low level. She couldn't have held off the war even if she tried, and would have lost the faction if she had. And now a baron was dead. Felt so much more real now. Sure, she got casualty reports daily and knew that people were fighting and dying. It was sad, yes, but she didn't know those people. She'd never met, spoken, or gotten to know them. That wasn't the same for Tony. She'd known him even before he'd risen to baron. Back when he was just trying to keep his neighborhood in Brooklyn together, beating away would be gangs and underlings. He'd helped her win over the city when it came down to either her or Big John. Yes, ma'am. He was killed on his way to figure out what's going on in the South. Reports have 3 contingents being wiped out rapidly, and he was sent to figure out why. Her assistant, Amelia, reported. So we don't even know who killed him? Zuri scoffed. We think it was the Viscount of Frostheim. We know he answered Vanessa's call, but we don't have any reports of his arrival as of yet. They could still be coming, but we won't know more until they get here. We're still trying to connect communications through Vanessa's disruptions. A different advisor said, the one in charge of her scouts. I told them to fix the stones days ago, she thought. Then why do you suspect the Viscount? She asked, curious about the reason. While no one was alive to report what happened, scouts and scrying have reported the aftermath. Bodies were frozen solid, snow and ice covered the camp in layers, and the wounds were made primarily by a hammer. One swung with immense power. The man handed over a matching paper detailing what he'd said for Zuri to read. Funny that I'm just getting this now. I'll probably have to replace him soon. I wonder if he's just incompetent or in with Big John. It was impossible to tell these days. Everyone was working for someone, and it felt like no one was working for who they said they were. It was a nightmare to keep track of on the best of days, and with so much changing by the second, nearly impossible. The report detailed exactly as he'd said. A layer of frost coated all three camps, with snow piling up by the foot. What appeared to be hammer strikes devastated the land, buildings, and, by what was left of some of the bodies, the defenders. They found more identifying weapon marks on the land itself than on what was left of the bodies. Hammer plus snow with the power shown all indicated the same thing. Zuri wanted to be annoying anyway. How do we know this was him? It could have been someone else with a hammer and ice affinity. Soon to be replaced, Marco paused, unsure if she was playing dumb or actually asking. He settled on asking, just in case. Scouts had to be healed of frostbite upon touching some of the ice left behind, which was 2 days after it had been conjured. Only one person has the skills and affinity to do that. It's been reported that his ice lasts much longer than it should, and is much more potent. One person we know of, she amended mentally. For all the years they had spent rebuilding the country, they were still ignorant of the rest of the world. Someone out there could probably do the same. In Russia, probably, or Scandinavia. Those seemed like the icy type. Hell, maybe even someone in Alaska could, for all they knew. Even reaching the west coast was impossible. Rumors said a path had been found, but it hadn't been confirmed. Ma'am? Marco asked, drawing her attention. Yes. I asked what we should do with the pylon in Brooklyn? Marco repeated. DeLuca's sister is requesting that the title pass to her, but others have claimed it should go to them instead. Let me guess, Zuri said. Jalen wants it? Marco didn't answer, but it was clear Jalen's name was among the list. He'd been fighting for his own barony ever since the 5 boroughs raised their pylons high enough for the title. Zuri would have helped him if he wasn't such a scumbag. A scumbag who was more likely than not working with John. What level is Isabella? Zuri asked. If she was going to side with DeLuca's sister, she needed to know she'd be able to hold the title. If she couldn't, it would just be signing her death warrant. Level 116, Amelia answered. Anthony was higher, but he lacked substance. Maybe comparing them to the other leaders she'd met wasn't fair. But that didn't mean it wasn't true. Jalen's 124. It would be close, and she wasn't familiar with either Isabella or Jalen to know how the fight would turn out. Let's hope Isabella knows what she's doing. DeLuca's wishes were for it to go to his sister, and I will abide by those wishes, Zuri said. Amelia seemed happy with the decision, while Marco didn't react. With her blessing, the faction screen updated so there were now 6 barons once again. Viscountess Zuri Adioi appointed. Baron Jacob Rossi Brooklyn. Baroness Isabella DeLuca Manhattan. Baron Nathaniel Whitman Staten Island. Baroness Eloise Prescott the Bronx. Baron Diego Garcia Queens. Baron Isaiah Towns. It was the most any one faction had that she knew of. Yet they were failing to gain land. Spring would come, and there wouldn't be room for enough crops. The harvest wouldn't be enough, and people would continue to go hungry. The less fortunate would starve, eating whatever dungeon monster they could find. It seems I need to get involved. I thought DeLuca and Rossi could handle it, but I guess not. The only problem was that she wouldn't be able to be gone long. Plots and schemes happened when she was in the city. Zuri didn't want to know what the children would come up with when the parents were away. Chapter 404, Fire and Fuel. Chris POV. Location, East Fort. After being interrupted on my way to the next fort, I continued on but stopped after only one fight for the day. The numbers were growing the closer I got to where they were concentrating their attack, and things were turning into a slog. Fights weren't the moments of intense battle that they'd been at the start. They were long, drawn-out chases most of the time, where, throughout it all, I was getting shot at, attacked, spells thrown at me, and all around hindered in every way imaginable. Poison, acid, lightning, fire, wind, blood, earth, all kinds of affinities were used against me, and not all of them were easily brushed off. Poison and acid lingered the longest, but shadow was by far the most annoying. Finding the person was an exercise in frustration, let alone killing them. I gained yet another level, but it did little to prop up the sinking ship that was my stamina. I was tired, injured, and needed a rest. The nearby Fort September or some other French word, was a good enough spot as any. The leader, Claire, a fire mage I'd expected to see everywhere, was a good enough host. By now, news had spread, and a room had been prepared for my arrival. It wasn't fancy by any means, but it was good enough to pass the time. I woke the next morning and pushed through the mounting fatigue. It felt like I could have slept for the entire day, and it wouldn't have been enough. I'll rest when it's done, I told myself, a feeling I wasn't experiencing for the first time. I bade Claire goodbye and ran off to the next fort. I was warned ahead of time, both by Claire and Rachel through the message stone, that this fort would be different. It was where the battle was thickest. East Fort was the direct center of the battle lines, and the numbers there weren't something I could just smash through like I'd been doing. I was skeptical. After cresting a low hill and seeing the fort and the ongoing battle, I was less skeptical. There were thousands of people, tens of thousands probably, and they were everywhere. The fort's walls were filled to the brim, and the fields surrounding the walls were covered for hundreds of feet. Even Frostheim on its busiest day didn't have so many in the streets. It made what I had already done feel like a drop in the bucket. The few thousand I'd cut down were only a fraction of how many in white I was seeing now. Spells rained down on the fort and splashed upon mana shield after mana shield. Some were noticeably stronger and of higher grade, but I was more focused on the fact that there were hundreds of the spell defending the fort. The number of mages just defending. When it looked like the only thing the fort was doing was defending, a massive gout of flame spewed from the wall. I could feel the intensity from where I was standing hundreds of yards away. It was so powerful. It spewed out hundreds of feet, incinerating all in its path. Blackened earth and ashes were left in its wake when the spell ended. That, and the slag from melted weapons and armor. Even Rachel would struggle to do something like that. Now that I looked, I didn't see a single flake of snow surrounding the fort for 1,000 yards. All that stood around the stone fortification was scorched ground and flash-dried mud. A large fireball screamed through the air and landed in the middle of a dense pack of attackers, ripping through all defenses and leaving a similar wake to the previous spell. Whoever was launching them was powerful. I wasn't sure what to do. Usually I would rush in and start swinging. I'd done as much 4 times already. Except this time I wasn't sure if I'd be helping. Fire seemed to be a massive part of the defense, and fire and I didn't mix all that well. The temperature, even from far away, was sweltering. It was uncomfortable, to say the least. I'll have to rely on force then. Getting hit with a hammer was still getting hit with a hammer. The temperature didn't much matter when your skull exploded. Before I could launch myself into the thick of things, my message stone vibrated in my pocket. I reached out with my mana and noticed it was Rachel who'd messaged me. Vanessa's asked me to tell you not to do whatever you were about to. Michael has it under control and doesn't want you interfering. If you head to the western gate, they'll let you in. Don't interfere? That went against all of my instincts. There was a battle in front of me, and I was being asked to stand by and watch. This is their war, and I did say to direct me as they saw fit. I just never thought I'd be directed not to fight. Instead of rushing in like my instincts demanded, I created a chair of snow and sat down to watch, not wanting to get any closer to the heat than I had to. The fight continued for over an hour. Fire rained down time after time, and while things were definitely hectic, the fort was enduring whatever the attackers could throw at it. Siege weapons hit the shield formation and deflected off harmlessly into the mud. Spells were intercepted with shields of mana, and arrows were either incinerated with fire or blocked with the same shields as the spells. Warriors charged the walls and were repelled violently. Based on the charred bones, this wasn't their first attempt at storming the gates. Every once in a while, a powerful spell would be launched, but it didn't change the course of the battle. No matter what the attackers threw, it wasn't enough to get through. As the early sunset darkened the sky, the pace slowed until the boom of explosions rang out every few minutes. Seeing how things had settled down for the night, I dispersed my chair and approached the western gate. It opened at my arrival and closed swiftly after I entered. I was then quickly led to a room simmering with fire mana, and I didn't need my aura to tell me I was being led to the man in charge. Rachel had mentioned a Michael a few times, and how he was the second strongest behind Vanessa. I could honestly say I believed her. The man's aura, even through the door, raged with enough power that it eclipsed nearly everyone I'd met. Even other leaders like Marcus didn't have as strong an aura. Depending on how far Austin had advanced, even he wasn't up to par. Rachel wasn't lying. While aura strength wasn't everything, it was a good indicator of power. I pushed into the room to see a man in blazing red robes sitting in a chair, swirling a drink in his hand. Based on the fluctuations I could sense, he was low on mana and felt the same exhaustion I did. He looked similar to how Rachel had described, except I wouldn't consider him middle-aged. He looked too young for that. The levels had done him well, if he was this revitalized. He was thinner than I was, and even without standing, I could tell he was shorter as well. His wavy brown hair had seen better days, but it wasn't disheveled, like I assumed my hair looked. Longer than described as well, like it hadn't been cut in a while. "Christopher, it's nice to finally meet you," he greeted warmly. "Put a name to a face and all that." "Likewise," I said as I shook his hand. The heat it held was immense. "Although today did not go as I thought it would." I know. You were expecting a fight, and I'm sorry to disappoint," he said and lifted a decanter of red liquid in offering. At my nod, he proceeded to pour it into a glass. I accepted the wine and gave it a deep inhale. I wasn't a connoisseur, but I could appreciate a good wine. Plus, I could use a drink. The flavor was good, and the kick it had surprised me. It was much different than the chilled elderberry wines we grew in Frostheim. Fruitier and bolder. It's from a vineyard in the Heartlands. A nice little place with a powerful druid viticulturist combination. Expensive, but well worth it in my opinion, Michael admitted. "I'll have to ask Alaric about it after their squabble is over." "I won't say I'm disappointed, just confused," I said after swallowing. "Not that you didn't have things in hand, obviously. I couldn't say I was sad at not being able to slaughter hundreds. I wasn't a psychopath. This isn't their first assault on the walls, nor will it be the last," he said and sat back down. "I only arrived a week prior, and this is the 4th time we've repelled them since. They try new things, launch what they can, but in the end, they gain little. They come out behind most of the time. I could have helped. I can fight without interfering with your flames," I said bluntly. "You could have," he admitted, "but that would have hurt us rather than helped us in the long run." My brows rose in confusion. "How do you figure? I know you must have lost people today. I saw as much from the hill." "We did, and while sad, it doesn't change the equation," he said, before abruptly changing the subject. "Tell me, how many levels have you gained?" I didn't answer him, but I began to see where this was going. "I myself have gained quite a lot, nearly 10 in just over a week. I assume you've had your gains as well." He conjured a fire above his hand, dancing around his waving fingers. "A fire grows with fuel, and you would have taken that fuel. With the levels we're both at, the amount we could gain is small compared to the amount of fuel we take. Essence. That's what it came down to. If I joined the battle, I would have killed many, and in doing so, taken the essence they held." "You had me stand by while people died for essence?" I asked, but my words failed to have any of the edge I expected. On a base level, a logical level, I understood. We did something similar during settlement waves when we let the warriors fight in front of the wall. Some of them died, but it was a tempering experience. What Michael was talking about wasn't that different, but it still tasted bad in my mouth. Not just for essence, he explained. For strength. So when we're asked to fight again and we will have to, more will be ready. Some levels and experience now outweigh the downsides. We bleed a little now, so we may save blood later. Whether that be another war, the next assessment, or whatever the future holds. I hated how logical it sounded. And did these people volunteer knowing this? I sought any reason I could to find the moral high ground. They did. He stated, those who still wanted to help but disagreed were sent elsewhere. Logistics, transport, or other forts. Places where bodies were needed. Everyone here knew East Fort would see the most battle and understood all the risks. They deemed the reward worth it. I took a larger drink. You were supposed to sip wine, but I ignored that rule. And I assume you will ask me to do so again? I asked. I'm not barring you from fighting or asking you to abstain. Just to keep things more contained. He said, I don't use everything I have to kill as many people as I can. Just those with similar strength to my own, or when the situation calls for it. I leave the weaker ones so that others may grow. So they might gain or improve a law, forge an anchor, or upgrade a skill. Could I do that? Stand by and watch? I'd been at the front of nearly every battle I'd been a part of. The only time I'd restrained myself was during weak settlement waves so that he was asking me to treat this like a settlement wave. I'm going to have to think on this. I said, I know what I said, and that still stands, but I need to think about this. Chapter 405, Sooner Than I Thought. Chris POV. Location, East Fort. Oh, what I wouldn't give to have my healing bed with me. I muttered to myself. It had been a tiring few days, and my body was on the edge of exhaustion. The fighting, the running, the fighting again, the running again, and then fighting some more. Even with my spirit coursing through me, it was barely enough to keep me going. After my discussion with Michael concluded, I was led to a well-furnished room in order to rest and think about things. I was able to do neither of those things. One, because I didn't have my ice bed, the treasure I missed most right now. And two, because I was deliberately choosing not to think about such things. I, instead, chose to yearn for what wasn't here with me. Instead of the cooling and refreshing treasure of a bed, I laid upon a mundane frame of wood, cloth, and stuffing. It was nice by those standards, but not magical. When that didn't do the trick of diverting my thoughts, I pulled up my status. Name: Christopher Zelensky. Race: D. Human * class. D. Warden of the North, Legendary. Level 127. Profession: D. Adept Runesmith, Epic. Level 102. Affinity. Arctic Faction. Frostheim. Leader. Title: Viscount. Strength: 3594. Agility: 1669. Perception: 750. Fortitude: 3091. Endurance: 1816. Vitality: 1230. Intelligence: 607. Wisdom: 969. Acumen: 566. Free points: 119. When this war is over, I want to be able to forge my first star. I already have enough to upgrade my body to copper, and it feels like my law has grown enough to take another step there as well. The concept of heaviness I'd integrated felt settled now, and after continued use in rapid succession, the connection between my three aspects of ice felt solid enough to reach for another. I wasn't sure what it would be yet, but I could begin looking once again. Maybe a debuffing aspect, a slow like what Field of Snow promised, or a sapping like Frozen Leech. I let my mind play with ideas for a moment before pushing on. While the last few weeks might have been some of the most hectic and draining, they also came with an increase in level and gains that outmatched anything I'd done so far. I stared at the 119 free points I had. I knew I needed to spend them in agility and perception, but I just couldn't bring myself to do so. It was where I'd dumped every free point so far, and it was a band-aid instead of a cure. The cure was leveling my profession. The agility I gained from Runesmith would more than keep up with my growing strength. If I kept using free points, by the time I reached the level cap, my agility would be so skewed and wildly out of the ratio I like to keep. Except this time, instead of being below the 2-to-1 ratio, it would be over. By a lot, too. The extra agility wouldn't hurt, but it felt wasted, as silly as that sounded. I wanted to shove it into wisdom instead. More mana was always good, and it would allow me to progress through the stars of primordial frost faster. My mana heart was already doing a lot, and I wished to advance it as soon as I could. By the end of D rank, I was projected to only reach 3,400 wisdom, which would only allow me the 2nd star. Not to mention that the levels would come slowly, as runesmith was much harder to level. To do the same would take a massive amount of valuable materials, 10 times as long, and a focused effort I wasn't sure I had in me. Even then, it would be rushing rather than growing. My skills wouldn't grow, and my options to keep an epic profession, one I'd spent so long chasing, would be slim. I'd gain essence, sure, but it would leave me poorer because of it. It wasn't like Warden of the North, where I'd gained nearly a dozen levels in a week. The essence I gained from my daily dungeon runs was nothing compared to the last few days. It would have taken me months, maybe a year, to gain as much as I had. Volwyn, who had advanced as soon as he arrived, was below level 120. Books said that the average person took somewhere between 5 to 20 years to get through all of D rank. I'd evolved in the spring, and now, less than a year later, I was already 27 levels through D rank. Nearly a third. The later levels would come slower, I knew, but even with that added in, I was around a fourth of the way done. The pace was blazing, from what I'd been told, compared to the wider universe. I wasn't sure if faction elites or champions were different, but it felt supremely fast from my perspective. I expected D rank to take a decade. Based on the way it was going, it wouldn't even take half that. I wonder if our assessment comes when the first person reaches D rank, when enough people reach D rank, or if it's just timed for when the average person should reach D rank. That puts what Michael said into relativity. Nope, I didn't want to think about that, but the last distraction I had was the 119 free points sitting in the bank. I could use more endurance, but that will make my agility problem worse. Can never go wrong with more vitality or wisdom, too. In the end, it was seeing that my agility was about to become my 3rd highest stat that cinched it. Also, my spirit could only do so much, and I was pushing myself to the edge of what my stamina could currently handle. All 119 went into endurance. Body of a Frostborn didn't kick in immediately, but I was in for an extra 89 strength when I next gained essence. Sigh. Now I was back to my decision. One I'd successfully put off for barely a few minutes. I'd known the effort had been futile, but I tried all the same. Procrastination was my natural instinct when the 2 paths that lay before me were unideal. Unideal wasn't a strong enough word, but it was what fit. The worst part, the part that had initially sent me reeling, was that it was so logical. If the argument was stripped of all emotion, it made sense. A rational amount of sense. It took me back to when I killed my first man. They'd been thieves, set to steal what little we had during a time of strife. They deserved it, and it was justified, but I still couldn't help how I'd felt initially afterward. I remembered Austin's words, not of comfort, but to help rationalize it. He'd said, "Think about it like you saved someone in the future from dying. Someone they would have killed had they continued living. The same logic could work here as well. That didn't mean I had to like it. Enough beating around the bush," I admonished. There were only really 2 options in front of me. I could agree with what was said and wait here and watch people die, or I could not. I'd given my word that I would be dispensable however they saw fit, but that did not include standing idle just to watch. There were other fights and other forts. I could go back to Fort South and plant myself there and repel everything thrown at me. Or I could continue smashing my way north. With that thought, I reached for my message stone. A device I was cherishing more and more. Its range was still shit, but there were new iterations coming out that extended it. D-rank artificers and runesmiths who could make higher-grade stones. I'd yet to study them in depth. Another thing to do that was still on my list. "Rachel, can you ask Vanessa if I'm needed anywhere else right now?" I sent with the faint hope I would. "Sure. Give me a second." Rachel sent back a few moments later. "Doing something I should have done already?" I asked. How fares the fort where you're at? You were sent to Fort North, right? Her response was swift this time, expecting the question most likely. Fiery. With so many fire mages in one spot, it's been an experience. After blasting away what attacks there were, I've rotated back and forth between a few forts that need me. Doing similarly to what you're doing in the south, I hear. Except with a bit less destruction and a touch more heat. If that was how the north is doing and I'd seen to the south, I wondered what Zuri would do next. It didn't seem like any of her faction's big hitters were here. The Baron, maybe, but even Rachel could have taken him on without a sweat. She'd either have to send more or send stronger. Or arrive herself. The stone buzzed. Vanessa's informed me that you've done more than she could have hoped and that you can rest until she gets here. Until she gets here? She's coming? I echoed the question on my mind. She's coming. Oh yes, and she aims to outdo you, from what I can gather. Being forced to watch has her blazing hot, and more than ready to let out some steam. The reason she hadn't been in the field to begin with was so that she'd be able to respond rapidly, wherever the need arose, waiting for Zuri to commit or show up. Now it seemed that wasn't necessary anymore. What does she intend to do? I asked. There was a delay as Rachel relayed my question. Push the advantage was all she said. A counter-offensive? Not what I expected, but it's strategically sound. If Vanessa leads the charge, with me, Rachel, and what I felt of Michael, Ian, Claire, and Zach, it would be a devastating attack. We'd agreed to a defensive alliance, and this technically didn't fall under the umbrella of defending, which was mute at this point. Once I'd agreed to come, I wouldn't stop just because the wind started blowing in the other direction. It seemed like my decision had been made for me. Vanessa was on her way, and I was to wait regardless. Depending on how fast she traveled, it would be a day or two. I could stomach a day or two of fake fighting. For their growth, I told myself. Just as I slipped the stone back into a pouch on my belt, it buzzed with a message once more. News just reached me, Zuri's on her way. Rachel's message was clipped, but said all it needed to. Vanessa was on her way. Zuri was on her way. It seemed like this was going to end sooner than I thought. Chapter 406, A Matter of Wants. Chris POV. Location, East Fort. I spent most of the first day resting. A healer also finally closed the wound in my side. But by then, my vitality had done a lot of the work. Cold meditation helped, but it was too low a grade to do much. My body and fortitude made me hard to heal. The second day was spent differently. I walked the walls, exploring the fort and its surroundings. The construction of it was solid, but Jonathan would know better than I would. He could feel the stone while I could only estimate. She made 18 of these. I had to give Vanessa credit there. I wasn't sure we would have been able to do the same. We didn't have the people to quarry that much stone, transport it, and then build the fort. Philip did great work, but he was only one man. Buying it was similarly challenging. The cost would be in gold, while we estimated our tax in silver per month. It all came down to people. Population size would be our bane perpetually. Zuri's on the flip side. She has too many people. From what I'd felt, her fighters were weak. They didn't have the opportunities we did. Dungeons were full to bursting with people willing to delve them. That weakness was probably the only reason that Vanessa was still holding them without being instantly overrun. As I walked the walls, I saw people going about their tasks. Men and women moving with practiced efficiency and experienced hands. It was to be expected after days of battle, but it was still impressive. Launch the jammers. The catapults along the walls had been firing intermittently, paused as the order sounded out. I was confused as I watched the people manning the weapons grab metal spheres from a pile separate from the stones they had been throwing before. Intrigued, I looked closer at the spheres and noticed the runework etched into the surfaces. The enchantment was unknown to me, but I was beginning to puzzle out what it did as 4 of the spheres were loaded into the catapult's basket. The runes weren't immediately familiar, but Rune Repository helped understand them. I hadn't spent much time with my new profession skill, but I'd filled it with every rune we had in our libraries. Most of the pathways were a chaotic mess, twisted in on itself and knotted in ways I didn't understand and didn't seem beneficial. There was a mana storage rune, followed by a disruption rune, with a few other seemingly random runes placed throughout the enchantment. Before I could peer deeper, the order to launch was given, and arms snapped forward, sending their payloads flying through the air. More than that, there was a wind mage who sent out a powerful gale behind them, to send them even further. Based on the angles and speed, they would wildly overshoot the enemy camp. They'd been on target just moments before, so I believed this to be deliberate. Based on the fact that they were called jammers, I could guess what they did, but I still hadn't puzzled out how. I got some looks as I walked over and picked a sphere up from the storage pile of them, but no one made to stop me. The work was hard to look at. Messy didn't even begin to describe it. Following the tangle of chaos took some time, but I gained a clearer picture the longer I studied. It was eerily similar to the device I had made for Rachel a year prior. She'd called it a monstrosity, and now I could see why she'd said that. At the time, I'd been too close to the project to understand, but now I did. The pathways were designed to tangle and disrupt one another. It slowed down the flow from the storage rune, turning the consumable enchantment into a slow release rather than an intense burst. There were limiters and other methods to achieve the same effect, but this got the job done. Pulling out my message stone, I examined it closely and compared the two. Expectedly, it looked like one was designed specifically to counter the other. The stone already had trouble sending through patches of chaotic mana, and the sphere artificially induced such a situation. A jammer just as described. Ramshackle and cobbled together, but a jammer all the same. Clever. I'd have to refine the idea, rework the delayed release, expand the disruption area. It would hold mana for around 6 hours before it ran out, forcing another sphere to be activated to keep up the effect. The area was large, but still required 4 of the spheres spaced out to cover the enemy camp. I put the metallic sphere back and filed away my ideas for later. The next interesting thing to draw my attention was when the western gate opened. A small group of cloaked figures entered swiftly before the gate closed behind them. The group was too small for reinforcements, and the power radiating from them was odd, concealed. If I hadn't been looking directly at them, I'd have missed them even with aura detection. Stealth experts. We got a dozen, but they increased the number of guards they sent. I don't think we'll be able to hit any more without more support. One complained. Don't be a wuss. We don't have to kill them all, just destroy the supplies. A well-placed firebolt would do the trick. A different one said. They walked off towards Michael's office before I caught any more. But I didn't really need to. That was enough. This is larger than I thought. Jammers, raids on supplies, more I didn't even know about. I'd wrongly assumed this was just a game of attack and defense. I wasn't sure why I assumed that, but the bigger picture was being revealed to me now that I'd thrown away that thinking. Probably assassins somewhere too. Rogues and rangers out behind enemy lines. I needed to expand my thinking, and I needed to do it before Frostheim was in this position. My straightforward fighting style had influenced me into thinking war was the same. It didn't help that all of our conflicts were relatively straightforward, cementing that thought process. When the attack finally came that day, I watched. When boulders and spells rained down, I let the mana shields take care of it. When attackers charged the walls, I let the defenders take care of it. It was difficult. My hands itched to rip my hammer free and start swinging, but I held off on jumping into the fray. When every instinct said to blast the area with Tundra's Descent, I held off. Frustrated me. When the enemy was nearing the walls, I couldn't hold myself back from sending a few ice arrows their way. The attack was weak compared to what else I could do, but still felled a few. Enough to ease the frustration, albeit barely. When an attacker stepped forward with a power above the rest, I conjured a javelin of ice and threw it his way, skewering him through with ease. I got looks as I was the only ice affinity, but nothing more than that. The essence was poor. After Tasunka, even the Baron didn't amount to much, and even he had more than what I was gaining. With both Michael and me easing the pressure, the attack was easily rebuffed. I ended up sending around a dozen ice arrows and a few conjured javelins. It was the bare minimum I could do. Literally. Michael gave me an appreciative nod, but I didn't respond in kind. I want this to be over. I walked off to my room, frustrated. My wish came a day later on the morning of the third day. Vanessa still hadn't arrived, but aura detection felt someone powerful coming close. Except it wasn't from the west, where Vanessa would arrive. It was coming from the east. I woke with a start, and my armor was on in a flash. In moments, I was atop the walls looking out with hammer in hand, looking for who was behind the beacon of power. This wasn't like the Baron from before. This was deeper, denser, and radiant, like Austin but different, less blazingly bright, but still luminescent. Zuri. Michael was next to me a moment later, staff in hand and a heat radiating out from him. Prickled my skin, but I held off from flaring my ice. "She's here," Michael whispered under his breath. "It would seem so," I said. I set my hammer down upon the stone. "Will you face her, or shall I?" His head whipped toward me. "You would do that?" It was then that I noticed his hands shaking slightly and his eyes wider than normal. His measured expression was slipping. He was afraid. Rightly so, based on what I could feel. "It is why I am here," I said simply. We stood in silence as we felt Zuri approach her faction's camp. She remained in the camp for a few moments before she soon departed, but not for the fort to attack. To the side, to an empty snowy plain, devoid of any cover or trees. "What is she doing?" Michael asked, confused. She pulsed her aura, as if to call out to both of us. I gave him a pat on the shoulder. "It seems she wants to talk." Before he could respond, I leaped from the walls and crashed into the muddy ground below. Michael hesitantly followed but landed much more gracefully. Instead of crashing down, he floated almost on a glut of heated air. We walked together toward where the lone woman stood. In the snow with winter by my side, I feared no one. Even if her aura was strong, a near match for my own, I wasn't going to shy away from a talk. As we neared, I saw the robes she was wearing and felt the enchantments laid upon them. I felt the staff and the mana it radiated. Powerful didn't begin to describe it. They have good craftsmen, I noted. Her staff seemed a match for my hammer, which wasn't something I'd ever felt before. A summon skill like mine? The snow crunched underfoot with every step, and we drew to a halt around 100 feet away. Her robes were stark white, the color of pristine snow with black accents to give it depth. It meshed with her skin well, dark skin highlighted by glowing white freckles on her face. Her eyes blazed with a similar light. Her hair was braided and tied back, and she stood at ease, but ready to respond. Her eyes were locked on me. "Why are you meddling in a war that is not yours?" A confusing way to start things, but I answered all the same, because I was called. "You'd fight just because of that? My people starve, and you oppose us because you were called." She scoffed, like the words themselves angered her. "You assume that the two are related," I said, "but they are not. I do not oppose you for any other reason beyond the fact that you are the aggressor. You could have done as I have, and sought land to develop where there was no one. You could have sought areas elsewhere, but you did not. You sought to claim what someone else had, and that is why I am here." "There is nowhere else," she said angrily. "Do you think I want this? The bloodshed and death. It is not a matter of wants. I did not want to be here either, yet here I stand." I responded. She was cut off as 4 more auras made themselves known. A raging fire coming from behind us, signaling Vanessa's arrival, and 3 others from behind Zuri, 2 of which were unknown to me, and one whom I'd only ever heard about. Ryan Claremont was here, and with him, I assumed, was the leader of the 3rd and final faction involved in this affair. I'd not seen hide nor tail of them so far, but that was about to change. Of the 4 new arrivals, only one drew my attention. It lacked the tint I'd come to understand was related to noble titles. It lacked the title but stood at a level comparable to mine. Interesting. Chapter 407 Agreed and Witnessed. Chris POV. Vanessa made no attempt to conceal or rein in her aura whatsoever. It blazed brightly and with an intensity impossible to mistake for anything other than anticipation. She was prepared and ready for a fight, even outnumbered as we were. Michael, Vanessa, and I on one side versus Zuri, Ryan, Bree, and a fourth I didn't know on the other. Michael, on the other hand, was less prepared to charge into battle with the odds against him. Ever since the 4 new arrivals appeared, his own aura retracted. Not completely, it was still suffusing the area around him, it just covered a smaller area than before. He was either unwilling or unable to assert control over a larger area. "You finally show your face." Vanessa was the first to speak, and directed her annoyance at Zuri, understandably. "I was beginning to think you never would." "My faction is large, and its needs are many," Zuri answered. "I am where I am needed most, which for now is here." Even when pressured by Vanessa's aura, Zuri kept her own defensive and warded the hot haze away completely without pushing back. She seemed less intent on this devolving into fisticuffs. "You brought company?" Vanessa finally looked at the 3 others standing beside Zuri, taking their measure. Based on her reaction, all of them were known to her. The last one, the man I was unfamiliar with, seemed to displease her, and not in a good way. He was an older gentleman, with a touch of gray that hadn't gone away with levels. That usually only happened with people who'd been older before the change. 60s or 70s, probably. A faint trace of crow's feet and wrinkles solidified that image, but it was his face that drew my eye. A calmness and stoicism that no one present matched completely. He reminded me of my grandfather with a similar posture. A warrior. A man who has seen battle. Military. Those thoughts confused me, as there was no one in any of the 3 factions we were facing that matched his description. Sure, there were former military members, but no one with such strength or characteristics. "As did you," Zuri indicated toward me. Michael couldn't be considered a guest. Not like the rest of us could. To remain silent, I whispered through my aura to Michael, "Who is the man on the right?" I wasn't sure if Vanessa could respond through her aura as I could, and with her gearing for a fight with her aura riled up, my aura couldn't get anywhere near close enough to her ear be unnoticed. Thankfully, Michael had the answer I was looking for, but had to whisper it quietly. "Robert Steele. A close friend of the Admiral, but not a leading member of his faction. He's more of a freelancer, if that makes sense. Similar to Austin." Then I thought, but what is he doing here? The Admiral and his faction weren't involved in this war. That much I was sure of, yet here he was. Michael watched me for any sort of reaction, but I showed none. It didn't change anything. If he wanted to involve himself, then so be it. "Have you come to surrender?" Vanessa goaded, a smirk on her face, rubbing in the fact that the tables had been turned since my arrival. Premature, but not untrue. Zuri's face tensed. "I could say the same to you. How much longer can you hold on?" "Me? We're not the ones dying in droves by the day." Vanessa prodded. "I haven't lost a baron, unlike you." Every insult and provocation Vanessa slung caused Michael to flinch slightly. If I hadn't been standing next to him, I would have missed it. He knew what Vanessa was pushing for, but he could do nothing to stop it. And neither did I. If this was how she wanted to play this, then this was how we were going to play this. Would this be my choice? No, but this was her war, I'd made that clear. The glowing freckles Zuri sported flashed in anger. "Why do you insist on provoking me? We could have come to an agreement before all this bloodshed. But you just couldn't give up. Could you? Give up? You wanted half my land. And for what, some coins?" Vanessa said incredulously. "No, I wasn't just going to give you what I'd fought for. Don't act like this is all my fault." It was at this point that someone other than Zuri or Vanessa spoke. "This is getting us nowhere." Ryan stepped forward. "Why don't we discuss things like civilized people?" "Quite you. The adults are speaking." Vanessa spat. Ryan flinched at the rebuke. "Now is that any way to dash? If I hear another word out of your twisted mouth, I'll burn it." Vanessa turned her full fury on him. "You were the one who instigated this. Don't think I'm unaware of that fact." "Ah, if she's right, the hand behind the coincidence is found. A fact I filed away for later." A shadow passed over Ryan's face, but he quickly covered in a smile. In the disarming way of his. I hated it. It was all so fake. His mannerisms, his words, all of it. I hadn't liked him the first time I'd met him, and that hadn't changed. Zuri directed her attention at me. You're just going to stand by and say nothing? What is there to say? I asked. We either come to an agreement here, which seems increasingly unlikely, or we fight, in which case words would have already failed. There isn't a solution you wish to advocate for. A peaceful end to this conflict or a conclusion that doesn't end in mass death. You're content to go along silently with whatever Vanessa wants. She demanded. All peaceful solutions were abandoned at the start of this war, before I ever became a part of this. There are no solutions to advocate for, I said simply. The only conclusions are either your surrender or ours, and surrender isn't in my nature. Seeing how everyone's eyes were still on me, either in astoundment or confusion, I went a step further. But if it were up to me, I'd duel and be done with it. You're just sending people to die at this rate. If there was one way I hoped this didn't go, was a continuation of the status quo. I keep killing, but I wouldn't enjoy it. If Zuri continued to send bodies to the problem, then I'd have to continue putting bodies in the ground. It was an undesirable outcome. Robert Steele POV. Well, he sure is blunt, Robert thought. He'd heard as much from Fitzwallace about him, but seeing it now, in what could be considered a tense environment, it just highlighted it more. The words weren't wrong, but it just seemed odd to be so dispassionate. Dispassionate wasn't even the right word, but he couldn't think of the right one. Dispassionate implied a lack of conviction, but that was far from the truth. If anything, his words only held conviction and little else. Like the emotion had been stripped from them. Only logos remained. Duel and be done with it. The flame which repeated. If only it were something Zuri would agree to. Her words dripped with condescension. It was bait, clear as day. Zuri wouldn't. You think I won't? Zuri said defensively. Maybe she would. She wasn't stupid enough not to see it, but she also couldn't be seen as weak. She would lose too much capital in her faction if she refused, and then continued to send forces to die. She may as well orchestrate the coup herself at that point. The web of deceit, ambition, and greed of her faction wouldn't let the moment go if she refused. Robert wanted to groan. This was supposed to be a diplomatic talk. Something to calm the waters, not spur them on. It was also against the reason he was here in the first place. With what quickly became 5 factions embroiled in war, it could very easily get out of hand fast. Which was the last thing Fitz wanted, and Robert reluctantly had to agree. Even if it meant sticking his nose in it when it was the last thing he wanted to do. Are you accepting? A tongue of flame danced around the woman in barely concealed expectation. Yet another action that pushed things forward. A pale white light began to emit from the staff in Zuri's hand. I am. What are your conditions? Cessation of your offensive and a non-aggression pact for a period of 10 years, plus reparations in gold, skill shards, and faction points during the next assessment. Vanessa quickly rattled off, almost like this had been planned. Zuri frowned, but nodded in assent. All land beyond 10 miles east of Flame Falls. Reparations in the form of food, and access to the flame. No access. Vanessa interrupted. The flame is not on the table. Zuri changed tack. All land beyond 10 miles east of Flame Falls. Reparations in food, dungeon access, high-grade raw materials, and faction points during the next assessment. Agreed. Agreed. Both women turned toward the man with the hammer. He seemed confused at first, that his idea had been agreed to and fleshed out at such speed, but nodded nonetheless. Witnessed. You may start when my hammer hits the ground. Wait, what? Before Robert could say so much as a syllable, the man grabbed the hammer in front of him and threw it end over end into the air. It seemed near effortless, but the giant weapon of ice soared high into the air, while everyone else tracked its skyward ascent in bewilderment. Ryan and Bree were confused, as this was not how this meeting was supposed to go, and it looked like the flame mage on the other side felt the same way. Robert hadn't thought it would get this far, and especially not so fast. They were trading barbs 1 second, then awaiting the starting gun the next. It all happened so fast. The time the hammer spent in the air seemed to stretch on, and not because it was thrown so high. It was a factor, yes, but the building tension worked to lengthen it exponentially. Vanessa and Zuri both backed away from one another and readied their staves. The mana of both of them stood ready to burst forth, while the bystanders quickly backed away from what was about to become an area of death. Robert put a hand on his sword just to give himself an anchor to think about how things had gone so wrong. The needed assurance didn't help much, but it eased his mind a small amount. Ryan and Bree had both drawn weapons as soon as the hammer was in the air, fearing an attack. They backed away without launching anything, but they still held their weapons at the ready. The only one who didn't look ready for a fight was the only one without a weapon. Christopher stood where he'd been the entire time, waiting for his hammer to come down with his arms crossed and legs straight. His legs weren't bent, ready to launch forward, and his mana wasn't threatening to burst forth. To all Robert's senses, he seemed unconcerned with rising tension and the fact that he'd just thrown his weapon into the air. "How did we get here?" It was a throwaway comment. "A duel? Seriously? What the fuck am I going to tell Fitz?" Chapter 408 Starfall. Robert, Kant. POV. Location: outside East Fort. The hammer impacted the ground similar to a ballistic missile from before. That much weight falling from so high up sent snow and dirt flying in every direction, matched in sound by a deep, drawn-out thud. Perfect for a starting gun, even if Robert didn't agree with the duel. Upon impact, bright orange and radiant white mana exploded out of the two fighters were cast instantly. Blazing fire mana coursed through Vanessa's hand and into a spell structure so fast he could barely see it, let alone study what kind of spell it was. Zuri was even quicker, as her element lent her the necessary speed to outdraw the flame which. Starlight blazed as her freckles intensified, coiling out of her arm and into a beam sent straight at where the flame spell was just beginning to activate. The beam collided just as the flames began to gather, and both spells collided in an explosion of force that sent wind whipping in every direction and throwing up snow once more. The impact from the hammer hadn't even subsided before their view was obstructed once more. The five people not actively fighting blunted the waves of force in various ways. Robert exerted a bit of aura to shunt it around him. Ryan stood behind Bree, and she blunted it for both of them with a shield of mist cast in front of her. Michael waved a hand, causing a red haze to appear in front of him, while the last of the five just stood there and let it wash over him. Robert watched, half an eye tracking the duel, and the other stuck on Christopher. He still hadn't taken a step back, remaining the closest to where Vanessa and Zuri were fighting. If Robert knew him less, he'd assume foul intent, but his intuition vetoed that thought. Not only was he known for his old-fashioned honor, but Robert also didn't sense any deceit or underhanded preparations being made by the man. His hammer, which had landed about a dozen feet in front of him, suddenly lifted out of its impact crater of its own volition. Robert's attention was drawn to it immediately, pushing the spells of fire and starlight exploding against each other to the back seat. The reason it drew such a reaction from him was that there wasn't any mana involved. All manipulation skills took some mana, some more than others, but all of them took at least some, ice manipulation included. The dossier Fitz had on the Northern Viscount confirmed he had ice manipulation, and it was suspected he also had wind manipulation. Neither skill was what was being used. Is that pure aura manipulation? It was too difficult to confirm if that was the case. Auras were much harder to sense minutely than mana was, and the surrounding environment couldn't have been more chaotic even if it tried. Vanessa and Zuri had both opened the floodgates and released whatever hold on their auras they had, while the rest of them used theirs to ward off the pressure. Some more so than others. Whatever fascination Robert could have gathered ended when the hammer landed back in Christopher's waiting hand, where he then placed it back on the ground where it had been originally. Both his hands rested on the weapon's pommel while the head was planted firmly on the ground as he observed the duel, but still kept an eye on the spectators as well. I'll need to update Fitz. Control like that is unheard of. The rising explosions drew his attention back. All of the snow in the area had long since melted from the heat. The only spot that still had the white flakes was a small area around Christopher. The rest had turned the ground slick with mud. Not that either woman noticed. Mage battles were different than warrior duels. With warriors, it was easy to clearly see who had superior technique, skill, strength, and all other aspects that dictated a fight. Even when both participants were evenly matched, you could still pick out mistakes or advantages one had over the other. Magic didn't have that same luxury. For Robert, at least. He wasn't a mage and didn't have the experience or knowledge needed to have an expert opinion on what exactly was happening as it was happening. To his untrained eye, Vanessa seemed to be losing, but from the way Michael seemed unworried watching his leader fight, that didn't appear to be the case. Every spout of flame or fireball she sent out missed Zuri by dozens of feet. Enough to sear robes, but not enough to have a large impact. Alternatively, every beam or spear of light hit the shields Vanessa had to conjure. One forced a defense while the other got away with just dodging. Simple arithmetic dictated that Vanessa was losing. That was until the larger picture became clearer. Every spell Vanessa had cast from the start was still burning. Even if it missed, it impacted the ground around them and continued to burn. A ring of fire was slowly but surely being constructed with every spell that was cast. Zuri seemed to notice this and kept her back toward areas already aflame. She forced Vanessa to either send spells at an area already alight, or to waste time and mana igniting where Zuri wasn't anywhere near. They're both being cautious, he thought. Neither were throwing around large, mana-heavy spells, resorting to smaller, targeted ones instead. Neither has called on their bloodline yet, either. They were both still cautiously prodding, trying to gain both knowledge and an advantage. Plus, it didn't seem like either was ready to duel to the death. There was a lack of extraordinary vigor and righteous commitment that was present when death was on the line. Robert knew of that feeling more times than he cared for, even before the world changed. The explosive game of back and forth changed in a flash. He hadn't noticed at the time, but the instant all surrounding fire mana became prominent, and there wasn't a speck of ice mana still in the area, besides around Christopher. Vanessa exploded in flames. Her hair, which was already a fiery red, looked to ignite and dance behind her. Her eyes glowed a cherry orange, which he had assumed was reserved only for piping hot metal from the forge. It was subtle, but her fingernails became slightly pointed, and if he had to guess, her canines as well. It wasn't only her physical appearance that changed, but her aura and mana signature as well. Both ignited with a forceful wave of flame, intensifying massively, much more than any physical transformation she had gone through. It was clear she focused her bloodline on magic. Bestial, most likely draconic. No other bloodline would provide such magic augmentation that matches. Phoenix, Fire Titan, Pyromane, and other high-tier fire bloodlines didn't match what Robert was seeing. Flame Nova! Vanessa yelled as soon as the change finished. With her as the center, a sphere of searing hot orange fire erupted and expanded over the entire field of battle. The wave of condensed mana alone would have staggered weaker men, let alone the force and flame that accompanied it. The grass, what was left of it, turned to ash in a flash from the intense heat, leaving a circle of scorched black and barren earth. With nothing left to burn, the fire finally went out, but only in the center. The ring was complete and still ablaze, trapping Zuri inside it. For the first time, Zuri had to shield herself from the damage. The sphere moved too fast to escape, and it left no area to dodge, forcing her to surround herself in a shield of glittering white light, dense with mana and law. When the shield of light fell away, it revealed Zuri had undergone a transformation as well. Lines connected what used to be independent dots of light on her face, forming unknown constellations. Her hair, which had once been a dark black, had specks of light radiating from it, as if it held stars itself. Her eyes radiated a pure white light, and a glowing mist trailed in her wake. Celestial, spirit or elemental based. He hadn't studied Starlight Affinity bloodlines enough to know more than that. It didn't appear to come from a beast, as she would have undergone more prominent physical transformations. Did you think I would be weaker because it's not night? Zuri goaded after dismissing her shield to show no damage. I don't need darkness or twilight. You forget that the sun itself is a star. I'd beat you even if it was midnight, just like I'm going to beat you now. Vanessa responded evenly, lacking the searing anger from before. Ring of fire. The circle of flame encompassing both fighters intensified, rising dozens of feet in the air. It not only cut off escape without consequence, but concentrated the heat inside the ring immensely. The air already began to distort, even with only a few seconds having passed. Robert saw Michael relax now that the ring was in place. Like with the trap set, all the rest was a given. Zuri seemed unbothered, but she was beginning to sweat from the heat. Her aura blunted most of it, but it was impossible to keep out the heat entirely. Mana gathered at the top of her staff, the crystal flaring bright for a flash, before shooting up into the air. The stream continued carrying mana as more and more of it gathered in the sky. 1 second, 2. Vanessa sent tongues of flame whipping out only for Zuri to let the blows land. Her robe blackened and her face contorted in pain, but she continued charging what had to be a powerful spell. Robert's senses were screaming at him to not let that pale orb hit him, and he doubted Vanessa couldn't feel the same. Zuri continually held her staff aloft while mana continued to swirl upwards, growing more and more concentrated. Vanessa started to cast larger spells in response, but didn't make it in time before the spell finished. With a strenuous heave, Zuri brought her staff down and yelled, "Starfall!" The mass of pale white mana started descending slowly, but picked up speed faster than a runaway train. By the end, it hurtled down so fast that even Robert wouldn't have been able to dodge. Vanessa didn't even try. The ring of flames doubled in size and intensity as Vanessa fed them an asinine amount of mana, then spiraled toward the center as if beckoned. The flame which had called, and it obeyed instantly. Fire and flame condensed from a wide 50-foot ring and wrapped and coiled around Vanessa like a protective suit of armor. All that fire burned so bright it matched the false star in intensity, and what the pale white orb lacked in heat, the fire surrounding the flame which more than made up for it. Felt like Robert's skin was burning even from hundreds of feet away. Its shape was mostly undefined, but Robert swore that some of the flames arranged into interlocked scales. Faint diamond-shaped, he didn't get to see any more than that before starlight met fire, and the largest explosion yet rocked the area. Even Christopher was forced back, and the man hadn't moved an inch since the start. Robert himself was forced to slide back, and he even had to use one of his defensive skills, anchoring his feet to the ground. What kind of force is at the center if this is just the shockwave? Robert blinked away the eye-wateringly bright flash only to see a cloud of dust obscuring his vision of where Vanessa and Zuri stood. Before the dust could clear, Christopher's head snapped to the right, and he picked up his hammer with a twirl. His aura began to ooze out of him threateningly as he shifted away from the duel and towards Robert. "Don't," Christopher rumbled. One word. No threats, no posturing. Only one word was uttered. "Don't." Michael backed him up a moment later, his mana hastening and his hands ready to start casting. The fire didn't respond as eagerly as it had to Vanessa, but it still leapt at the call. It took until he looked behind him at where Bree and Ryan stood that he understood. Ryan was midway through casting something with Bree coiled to leap into the cloud of dust as soon as it cleared. The Northern Viscount's words weren't heeded, as the two continued what they had started. "No!" Robert screamed, but it was too late. Ryan's spell finished, casting a soft light upon Bree, and she shot forward faster than anyone expected. Everything was going to shit, and they still didn't even know if the duel was over or not. Chapter 409 Gravity of the Situation. Chris POV. Location: outside East Fort. I had known this was a possibility from the start, but I just hadn't thought they'd actually go through with it. Maybe it was my thinking that clouded my judgment? The fact that the actions I was witnessing were so far from what I would even consider. It didn't matter now. Bree was hurtling forward far faster than I could match, and I wasn't sure what kind of condition Vanessa was in. Her shield could have held, as it screamed power to my senses, and she could have emerged from the collision none the worse for wear. Or, she could have been severely damaged and entirely unprepared to face the combined attacks of New Canada's and Boston's leaders. I knew she wasn't dead. Her aura was still alive and burning, but that didn't mean she wasn't in the process of dying. With no way to step in front of Bree, and doubtful I'd be able to raise an ice wall in front of her to block at the speed she was going, I did the only thing I could think of: I threw my hammer as hard as I could. It was tricky, aiming it well enough to hit a target moving so fast, but fortune smiled upon me. As soon as it left my hand, I knew it would land. After dealing with the immediate threat, my mind started kicking into fighting gear. My knee-jerk reaction was to stop the charging assailant, but now I was moving on to the bigger picture. A fight with both leaders who were both barons plus the admiral's friend was going to be tricky. Focus on attacking them. I spoke to Michael through my aura. My aura was so riled up that it was difficult to form words, like shouting into the wind, but I managed. Do not defend me or shield me. Defend yourself if you must, but prioritize offense. After instructing my ally, I called on the core of frost inside me. My bloodline burned through my veins as the changes to my body were made. My height increased by nearly 2 feet, and my body filled out with over 200 pounds. The rest of the alterations were superfluous, and I didn't have time to think about them right now. Hair and eye color didn't much matter right now. Weight of the Arctic kicked off as soon as I made my attack, and glacial presence was already running on max. The only choice I had left was to activate Battle Fury or not. Robert wasn't a baron officially, missing the title, but he was strong enough to acquire one easily if he wanted to. Facing 3 baron-level threats, I didn't hold back. Fury was easy for me. It was an old friend, and one that didn't need any encouragement. It helped that I was actually furious at what just transpired. Interfering in a duel was dishonorable enough, but to aim to assassinate Vanessa? That was something I couldn't tolerate. My stats rose to heights I usually didn't experience until after an hour of fighting. All the recent levels were being multiplied by Fury and Presence, along with my bloodline, which was usually a state reserved for later in a fight. Now I had it at the start, and all of this happened before my hammer crossed the burned field. When it finally did, it slammed into Bree's side, and it did so with little fanfare. There was no mana exploding out or explosions to be had. I didn't have the time to charge it with a skill or do anything fancy. Only pure force and momentum. But it was enough. The woman shielded herself with a layer of mist as she had before, which was what probably saved her from a broken arm and ribcage. But the unexpected blow caused enough of a delay that the shield was hastily created. Still, it was enough to blunt the worst of my hammer, and she was sent skipping into the distance with only a cut-short grunt of pain, completely halting her charge forward. With the immediate threat dealt with, I turned to my other 2 opponents. Ryan was casting another glowing spell while Robert was still screaming at him to stop. Ryan ignored the man, of course, as a ball of light was sent my way. Snow flowed up from the ground around my feet and condensed into dense plates. Glacial heavy plate wasn't the best against light aspect spells, but it was better than nothing. It and the armor underneath, combined with my fortitude, could withstand more than people assumed. I was expecting an impact or a force to weather when the spell hit me, which made me unprepared when there was none. My raised arm did nothing to stop the light, as there was no impact to block. Instead, a sluggish haze settled over me. My body felt slow and disconnected, while my eyes refused to focus. The light was playing havoc on them, blinding me to whatever was happening. Unsure of what was happening, I did the only thing I thought could protect Vanessa. Tyr's judgment formed chains of spirit that shot from me and into Bree and Ryan. Curiously, a third didn't form for Robert for some reason, even though I'd expected it to. I'd have done so right off the bat, but it wouldn't have stopped Bree's forward advance. The chain disallowed fleeing a fight, but it did allow room to dodge. There was some slack in it to begin with that I wasn't certain would have prevented her from reaching Vanessa. Plus, while the chain shot out quickly, it wasn't instantaneous. My hammer was faster. While I fought through the hazy outlines of what was happening, a sword impacted my armor of ice, chipping off a few shards but not enough to get through. Still blinded, I reached out and backhanded whatever was in front of me. I felt a thud and heard something tumble across the ground, but I wasn't sure what exactly. Abandoning normal sight, I reached out with aura detection to get a semblance of what was going on, but everything was fuzzy. There were too many powerful auras to get a clear picture, and the chaotic mess was barely better than my blurry eyesight. Bree was rising, or moving at least. Ryan was lying prone a few feet away, and Robert still hadn't moved. I felt a blazing heat soar over my shoulder and land right where Ryan was lying, sending him exploding even further away. With the reprieve, I sent mana coursing through Jotun's resistance to rid myself of whatever hex was slowing and blinding me. The skill wasn't designed for stuff like this, but with a boost of my spirit, it ripped through all the foreign mana inside my body. Everything that wasn't Arctic mana or connected to frost was forced out, and I could see once more. Ryan was bleeding and burned, while Bree was charging at me faster than I could track. She was a blur with the assistance of whatever Ryan did. "Stop this! Stop this now!" Robert yelled. An explosion of purple mana settled in a haze over the area. His words were accompanied by a weight settling over the field. It wasn't aura pressure, but from a skill or spell of some kind. For the first time, I got a feel for his affinity. Before, he'd kept all his mana contained without leaking any out. Such a practice was unusual because it went against what was natural. The body naturally drew in and leaked mana, similar to breathing. Remaining locked tight was uncommon to say the least. My weight, which was already high from natural bulkiness and enhanced by my bloodline, rose precipitously. The force pressing down on me was like being at the bottom of a deep lake. Gravity. It was extremely rare, and not something I'd ever faced before. The fight had already escalated past where words mattered. I ignored him just as Ryan and Bree had ignored him before. I felt my hammer off in the distance through my link to it. It had deepened immensely since I first acquired the skill. Where it had once been a faint thread, it was now a thick cord connecting me to my weapon. Ice manipulation wasn't even needed to rip it back toward my hand. It wasn't the graceful journey I'd demonstrated previously. It was a sharp tug that sent it soaring back with an impressive amount of force. Slower than hurling it physically, but still fast. I had to tug it back with my spirit, which didn't have the same heft as my muscles. Not yet, at least. It was still growing. Weapon in hand, I slammed it into the ground, activating Frozen Rift. The skill didn't only open rifts. That part was optional. What I molded the skill to do now was send sharp, jagged spears of ice ripping up in a line in front of me. Even with the additional gravity, Bree hadn't stopped her charge, and I met it with a line of spikes ready to spear her through. The ice itself came from the lands of eternal winter, where Frozen Rift drew power from, and wasn't something to be ignored. If I'd conjured it normally, sure, it could be shattered through with enough force. Bree didn't chance it, dodging the line of ice off to the side, where Michael followed up with a jet of flames, anticipating her dodge. The flames met another wall of mist, ending in a burst of superheated steam. The temperature was becoming a problem. I didn't want to use Tundra's decent with Michael behind me, and I still wasn't sure how Vanessa fared. She might need the fire mana saturated in the area to recover or heal, similar to how I used the cold. A flash of light drew my eye, and Ryan was standing once more, completely healed and devoid of any blood or burns. He glowed like the sun with blonde hair replacing his usual brown. His bloodline seemed regenerative. Annoying. Robert was forced to intercede between four powerful fighters, or to choose a side. His gravity well, or whatever he was doing, hindered and slowed but didn't incapacitate. We were all too strong for a single skill of his to end the fight. He'd need to go all out to do that, which meant making a decision. He chose a side. The wrong side. It seemed his sword was for decoration because he came at me with his fists. It was either a sly deception to make people assume he was a swordsman, or he was trying to be non-lethal. I wanted to snort. No one faced me without their best. If he was a swordsman, he'd need to draw it. While his aura was powerful and his affinity was strong, if he didn't use his all, he would lose. I met his fist with my hammer, and it went the way to be expected. The only exception was that his arm wasn't pulverized like I assumed it would be, only blown back. It was like hitting a block of steel. His bones didn't crack, and his hand wasn't evaporated. He didn't go flying, skipping, or tumbling back, only skidding a few feet. It was harder to swing with the added gravity, and it lacked any skills or spirit empowerment, but it was still a full swing. Dense and heavy. Body of copper? Michael continued to cast spells of fire and flame while I fended off any attempt to get to him by going around me. Walls of ice or similar jagged spears of ice as before cut off any path to the fire mage. Robert's fists darkened as he called on his own bloodline. His eyes turned purple, and his hair lost all gray, turning jet black. I wasn't sure what it was, but his aura spiked aggressively. The only one not to call on their bloodline was Bree, which was interesting. The only thing she'd done so far was shield herself with mist or charge forward with her swords. Now that I thought about it, she wasn't using any other skills or laws like the rest of us. I was leaning heavily on my ice law, Michael on his fire, Ryan on his light, and Robert on his gravity or weight law. I wasn't sure which. Bree, though, was only fighting with her body and defending when necessary. That oddness was dismissed as she charged toward me once more with her swords raised. Arctic mana coursed through me as I brought my hammer around and activated Meteor Strike. Instantly, the force applied to it multiplied, dragging my swing down and off target, leaving Bree to easily sidestep and hit me with both swords before I recovered. No Meteor Strike. Then, I thought, another hex flew at me, but was burned away by fire before it could reach me. I told him not to shield me, but I had to admit my thankfulness for the fact. The hexes were harder to shrug off than the physical blows were. I wasn't used to being debuffed like that, and it was a weakness I'd have to remedy. What on God's green earth is going on? A feminine voice raged. Vanessa, armor of flame torn and nearly shattered, leaned warily on her staff from a round depression in the ground. Her hair still blazed, and the flames still danced, but she'd seen better days. Zuri stood off to the side, looking better on first appearance, but was similarly haggard and drained from their duel. Both were staring, confused about what had turned into a four-person death match. "They aimed to assassinate you, my lady," Michael roared, sending more fire down range. Vanessa was taken aback and looked to me to confirm. I couldn't take the time to answer normally, speaking through my aura instead. "They aimed to interfere." My attempt to dissuade them was ignored. It came off with an unnatural calmness, as I couldn't be bothered to add emotion artificially through it. With a lower voice only Vanessa could hear, I added, "Something odd is going on. Robert is holding back, and Bree is acting strangely." The only one going all out was Ryan. Chapter 410 Immutable. Chris POV. There was a brief pause as everyone who had been fighting realized that both Zuri and Vanessa were still alive. Roughed up a bit, but still breathing. Ryan looked at the two of them curiously, while Bree's expressions didn't change. Robert was relieved, and it seemed as though a weight had been lifted. Funny how he was doing the opposite to us right now. That pause ended as I launched forward at Bree with my hammer raised. She was quick, agile, and always in the wrong spot during the fight. I wanted to eliminate the hassle before moving on to Ryan. He kept healing and boosting Bree while also sending out hexes at me. Everyone knew to kill the healer first, and to do that, I needed Bree out of the way. Robert was different. Killing him was not advisable. I'd do it if I had to, but I currently wasn't forced to, as there was no chain of judgment connecting us. The other two, though, had no such luck. They would die where they stood. My sudden swing took the woman entirely by surprise, as she expected more to be said before the fight resumed. She'd assumed wrong. Any misty shield she could have used to blunt or deflect my blow arrived too late. Her reaction time slowed just enough by Frozen Leech and her incorrect assumption. It was a subtle skill I'd applied to all three of them at the start of the fight, and it did its work slowly. I didn't get to use it often, as it wasn't suited for large amounts of weaker enemies but a few strong ones. That was where it shined. My hammer, filled with the violent energy of Shattering Hammer, landed squarely upon her side, and she went flying off into the distance. The angle of my swing sent her soaring rather than skipping off the ground so that she'd go further away. My goal of removing the nuisance was achieved. Vanessa and Zuri both got over their brief shock quickly at Bree being sent flying and began casting spells at one another once more. The casts took slightly longer now that they weren't in prime condition, but both had been through enough that a little weariness wouldn't put them out of the fight. I put what was happening behind me out of mind. Vanessa could handle herself, and if she couldn't, I wanted to find out now. Fighting together was the deal. Protecting her was not. Ryan's face was contorted in concentration and strenuous effort as the spells left his hands faster and faster. One shot off toward Bree, a healing spell most likely, while 2 more were cast toward me. I'd had enough of his spells and finally called down Tundra's Descent. The fire flingers would figure it out. Cold and fire warred in the area as the pressure shifted wildly and violently, bringing unpredictable winds blowing through the area. Perfect. My wind law reached out with my middling, wind manipulation, as I poured more into Tundra's Descent. Maybe if I'd taken northern winds, it wouldn't be as hard to do, but that was a choice long past. Instead, I leveraged my laws and caused Arctic mana to explode out of me, draining me of over a quarter of my mana. Fighting off Vanessa's fire was much harder than I expected, and the area I claimed was smaller than I'd hoped. The fire had a tenacity to it that I envied. My ice could use something like that. It already had a resilience, but there were always ways to push it further. The cold functioned almost like a corrupting energy. The wind carried it toward the flying spells, and the ice pervaded it, dominating the mana used to fuel it, turning it into a light frost mixture. It was slightly against its nature and took a lot to do, but it was worth it. When the frosted light spell landed, the blindness and disorientation never came, leaving me perfectly suited to continue charging toward my enemy. Robert tried to stop me, but flames from 2 sides held him off. Ryan's concentration turned to worry, and following worry was fear. It was a look I usually disliked seeing, but on his face, I felt nothing but satisfaction. He tried to dodge, attempted to escape me, but he didn't get far. The fight hadn't been raging long, but it was enough to start seeing my stats ramp up from weight of the Arctic. My swing speed and quickness weren't static, and it was a problem people usually failed to compensate for before it was too late. Any assumptions on how fast I could charge or how quickly I could swing needed to be constantly adjusted, or it would leave them in a poor position to face my hammer. A similar position to what my fellow northern leader was facing now. Shields of light flared brightly around him in a protective aegis as he activated spells and skills alike, but I pressed on. My hammer came up high and promised devastation, only to then be increased further as mana filled the weapon and its descent began. If Robert wanted to throw off my swings with gravity, I would use that to my advantage. Meteor Strike and Shattering Hammer caused my hammer to glow with a dancing aurora, and the added force courtesy of the gravity brawler sent it screaming down faster than ever. Light barrier after light barrier shattered like paper, loud cracking sounds their only accompaniment. Ryan turned pale white, watching death come for him, when an excruciatingly sharp pain tore through my side. It was in the exact same spot that had just been healed, which was rather tender. A dagger had found its way there from a hand I hadn't seen nor felt. A wafting darkness surrounded the new man, revealing who I knew only through description. Pierre, Ryan's guard commander. Even with his attempt to divert my swing through pain, my hammer's course was only altered slightly. I taught everyone to master their instinct to flinch in the face of pain, but even I wasn't immune to it all the time. It wasn't something you could kill off completely, at least not in 6 years. My hammer was still going to land, just not as cleanly as before. At least that was until a bolt of purple landed on Ryan from the side. All of a sudden, it was like down for him was off the left. He didn't have long to fall horizontally, but it was enough to escape the worst of my blow. It wasn't enough to escape all of it. Ice scraped and tore along his left arm, which was just enough to get Shattering Hammer's energies to transfer to my target. I did the same thing I'd done when facing the Blood Berserker in Lakeshore. Commanded the violence to wreak havoc upon his insides. Blood poured from his mouth and nose as his internals were torn asunder, staggering him from a pain worse than I was feeling, no doubt. His sideways fall turned into a sideways crash, as he was sent spinning from all of the odd and unpredictable forces acting on him. Still, my foe wasn't dead, and there was a new one standing behind me holding a dagger in my side. Jotun's resistance fortified my body enough that he couldn't twist the dagger, and I reached out to grab the man but missed. It was a good thing I wasn't aiming for him. I'd known my grasp wouldn't be fast enough to outdo his agility before I even moved, which was why I aimed my grasp at something else. I was aiming for his weapon, which he lacked the strength to hold onto when someone like me had it grasped by its bladed end. The edge bit into my palm, through the layer of ice and metal covering my hand, but one more cut didn't bother me. It was worth it in exchange for disarming him. Faced with the option to hold on to his weapon and become locked in close quarters with me, or letting go and backing off, he chose the latter, backpedaling out of my range and toward where his leader had fallen. I brought the dagger close to my face and observed the impeccable runework etched into it. A capable and steady hand had created the runes, along with an equally capable smith. Piercing runes along with light runes and fire runes. Everything to not only pierce my armor, but glacial plate as well. Fire and light were the perfect counters. The weapon had been designed for me and given to a man suited to wield it. I growled my fury, threatening to take over. I hadn't let it before and I wouldn't let it now. It was a beast hard to tame, but one I'd worked hard to control. Always the rogues, I fumed in my mind. I'd been stabbed in the back not once, not twice, but now 3 times. Well, the second attempt I caught in my sleep before it could land, but it still counted. Thrice. I closed my fist around the metal blade, pushing its hardness to the point of brittleness. Every smith knew what would happen next. The blade shattered into pieces, falling to the snow along with drops of blood. By then, Pierre had picked up Ryan from the ground and made to flee, but the chain of spiritual judgment snapped taut, forcing them to stay. Fire, starlight, and hazes of purple surrounded the 3 of us, and even mist signaling Bree's return, but I ignored all of it. I'd been angry before, but now I was furious. I charged toward the duo regardless of the wounds. In my desperate bid to close the distance, I didn't notice that Glacial March and Charge were both active at the same time for the first time. Tyr's judgment didn't reel in as distance closed, so they ran from me as far as the chain would let them. Pierre obviously had more agility than I, but strength played in how fast one could charge in a straight line. He also hadn't thought how carrying Ryan would slow him. My stats had nearly doubled by this point, with weight of the Arctic reaching 30%, and the distance between us was closing, no matter how hard he tried to run. I saw the decision playing across his face. The choice to leave his leader behind and flee. Surprisingly, the backstabber didn't throw the man away, keeping him in his grasp as he did all he could to run. Even less pleasantly, I saw Ryan's color returning and his wounds visibly healing. He'd left his exterior wounds for last, and they were now slowly starting to close, which meant his insides weren't as shattered as I'd hoped. Fucking healing bullshit. A wall of pale, astral light formed in front of me, but I didn't give it a second thought before smashing through. It resisted, but couldn't halt my momentum completely. I was slowed, but still moving. A bolt of purple moved too fast to dodge, landing upon my back, and I started to fall backwards, away from my foe. No! I lashed out and gripped the snow with a stranglehold with ice manipulation, but it wasn't enough. I could feel the snow falling with me, unable to hold my weight. My aura ripped into the ground, finding any hold it could in a much less graceful manner, but I didn't care about grace right now. My backwards tumble halted, and I pushed myself onward with aura and manipulation alone. I was a heavy man, but my will was enough to haul me forward. I wasn't about to let them go. The fight had moved with us, apparently, but I didn't have the bandwidth to look back. The distraction was enough for the 2 to catch their breath. Ryan was standing on his own power now, while Pierre had a cold sweat running down his face. Both were waving a hand at the ethereal chain, trying to work out how to break it. My face wasn't visible under a layer of ice and my helmet, but my grin turned smug. There was nothing they could do. Something vile was pulled from a sheath. A sword of the purest light I'd ever laid eyes on extended from a pommel I hadn't even known was there. Where Ryan had drawn it from was unknown, as was where he'd gotten it. It stank to my senses. It screamed something I'd thought I wouldn't feel in a long, long time. It wasn't demonic, but divine. Divine in a way I hated. I'd felt it only once before, on a recording of a person I'd sworn to kill. My feelings on the matter didn't change what followed. The The sword of light was brought down on the chain, sending searing pain coursing through me. It was brought down again, sending out a second wave. The sword had cracked what I'd thought immutable. The third swing shattered it. Pain. Searing, excruciating pain worse than anything I'd ever felt or imagined burned inside my spirit, causing my vision to darken. I thought body refining was the worst pain I'd ever feel. I'd been wrong. My arms felt distant and ungainly as I tried to move. My legs buckled as the steps I tried to take faltered. I couldn't help but cry out in anguish. As the burning continued, the second chain anchored to my spirit was pulled out, ripping the section it had been connected to. Where it had been anchored couldn't hold it now that it was weakened. Not only was my spirit on fire, but a chunk had also been ripped from it. My hammer fell to the ground through weak hands. It was nearly too much. The narrowing of my vision tried to darken completely, but I wouldn't let it. I pushed all of that pain into sheer determination. "No, you don't get to leave," I screamed, my throat hoarse. Thankfully, whatever had been messing with my gravity had ended, as I used whatever strength I could muster on my legs to leap forward, accompanied by pulling on my aura and ice both. My aura was weak, weaker than it had any right to be, but I pulled on it all the same, ignoring the pain. Ryan was so stunned he didn't react in time. My lunge wasn't graceful enough for a full tackle, but it was enough to grab hold of his newly healed left arm. With my grasp anchored, I poured all my will and mana into pervading cold, empowered by both my laws. It was the only skill I could think of, as my hammer had fallen to the ground behind me. I did to his body what I'd done to his spells previously. Arctic mana flowed in large rivers out of me, strengthened with my laws, through pervading cold and into Ryan's arm. Instantly, 2 black handprints began to grow and expand. My bloodline amplified things further, as it empowered any and all things frost-aligned. Frostbite had set in immediately and spread with every millisecond I kept pouring mana into him. It wasn't even a heartbeat before his entire lower arm was black and frosted over. Ryan screamed, a scream of anguish and pain eclipsing my own earlier. He pulled away from my grip, but I had too much strength to let go now. Even weakened as I was, he couldn't match what I was best at. Pierre tried to help pull his lord away from me, but both weren't enough. Black frost inched further and further up his arm as my mana got lower and lower. I wasn't sure if I'd have enough, but I was going to find out. He tried to fight it as his body started to glow, but the black continued to expand. Slowed, but not halted. A mentality I'd matched earlier physically, applied magically now. Ryan's screams continued as the line of frost reached his shoulder when something unexpected happened. His pulling away, along with Pierre's tugging, weren't enough to rip my hands away, but my grasp was no longer the weakest link. His arm, which was now entirely black and covered in frost, shattered. My hands closed tight around shards that had once been flesh as the rest of his arm fell to the snow in pieces. If I'd thought he couldn't scream any louder, I would have been wrong. A stump of blackened skin and muscle with frozen blood met my gaze as Ryan was pulled away from me. Now that I wasn't countering their force, Ryan and Pierre sent themselves tumbling out of my reach. Pierre picked up his screaming lord and ran quicker than I could adjust or catch up with. Seeing them flee ignited a righteous fury inside me. I called my hammer toward me on instinct, ripping it from where it had fallen and grasping its frosted wood. In seconds, it was in my hand once more and I applied every iota of force my body and spirit could produce. The action caused a fourth searing pain to rebound through me, but I ignored it for what was in front of me. The last of my mana was sent into the weapon and sent hurtling through the air after them, thrown with the last of my strength. All I could do was look on as it flew after them, hoping it was enough to kill them both. End of chapter 410.